For all verified facts, subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello and welcome. The vaccines have finally arrived in India. Emergency approvals have been given on Sunday by the country to two vaccines, the Oxford-Astrazeneca developed Serum Institute of India vaccine Covishield and the Bharat Biotech Covaxin. Now, these are two different vaccines. The vaccine announcement or the announcement for launch has also been greeted with controversy. One reason being that the accusation that there has not been enough and sufficient data that has been revealed to the public, and more specifically in the case of Covaxin, the data on phase 3 trials are not yet out, and therefore the vaccine's efficacy is under question. Now, the question that we are posing and trying to understand is how is this different, and to what extent is this important when compared with other vaccine rollouts that have happened in the rest of the world? First. Secondly, what is the downside when something like this happens? And thirdly, how should this process be done in a manner that everyone, that is including you and me, who are eventual consumers or customers of this vaccine, feel confident that it is going to do the job it is supposed to do, given the fact and understood by all that it's been done in a big hurry all over the world. To discuss this, I'm joined by two experts, Dr. Anant Bhan, researcher, global health, bioethics and health policy, and also Murli Nilkaltan, a lawyer and former general counsel at Cipla and Glenmark, a pharmaceutical industry lawyer. Thank you both for joining me. So, Dr. Bhan, let me begin with you first. So the first question is, as a layperson, I'm now aware that vaccines have been launched in many parts of the world. America has already vaccinated millions of people. The UK has vaccinated millions. Canada has vaccinated many of its citizens. Other countries are following. China and Russia too have begun vaccinations. Now, in India, the approvals have only come now, almost a month after those other vaccinations started. So why is it a concern here that we are not following due process?
Sure. Thanks, Govind, for having me. As you're rightly pointing out, COVID-19 vaccines have been in development for now quite a few months. It's been expedited everywhere in the world, including in India. These two vaccines that we are talking about are dealing with a vaccine which initially was developed, obviously, with Oxford and AstraZeneca, and then has been licensed to Serum. So that's Covishield. And then Covaxin, which has been domestically developed largely by Bharat Biotech in collaboration with ICMR. Now, fundamentally in science, what you need for any product to be licensed, especially a vaccine, which, as you know, is a preventive modality, right? So it's given to healthy individuals with the hope that the vaccine will help prevent infection. So it's slightly different from, say, drugs, which are used for those with a medical condition and for treatment purposes. Now, with vaccines specifically, you also then expect to have certain data sets, chiefly around dosing, safety, and efficacy, because that is what will tell us if the vaccine is useful to use in a large population, right? Now, globally, that is what is the kind of data that regulators have been looking for, and regulators should be looking for with respect to any vaccine, and specifically also COVID-19 vaccines. There is no science exceptionalism which can happen when you have a pandemic, right? So you can probably make things happen faster, including regulatory turnaround times, but you cannot take away the fundamental requirements of how you find out if a particular intervention, specifically a vaccine, works or not. Now, the countries that you've talked about have largely used the vaccines where there has been a publication or data on phase 3, and obviously before that phase 1 and phase 2 of the vaccine. So Pfizer, Moderna, for example, which have been licensed in the US so far, have had efficacy data been available with the regulator and subsequently, in some cases, also published. With AstraZeneca, they've had a large set of studies happening and phase 3 data also made available, right? So that on that basis, the UK regulator has decided to also give permission besides Pfizer to AstraZeneca. In India, we don't have local efficacy data for AstraZeneca, Oxford's vaccine, which is being tried out by Serum. But what we have is an application which is supposed to have the UK permission and added on to that local bridging data. Now, what is a bridging data? Bridging data is typically done when you have permission from a foreign regulatory regime and then you want to extrapolate that data into, say, another context. But for that, you need to also prove that you are finding similar things in the local context. So you might do a smaller study which can look at safety and efficacy, and then you say that based on that foreign larger clinical trial and these smaller local studies, kindly give us permission to market this particular intervention. So that is what Covishield is about.
Right. So can I quickly so the two key points you're raising is in the first vaccine, which is Covishield, we do not have local data, and for the second one, which is Covaxin, we don't have stage 3 or stage 3 trial data. Is that right?
Yeah, so a few weeks ago, the health secretary had mentioned very clearly that the two conditions under which they would think about such an authorization would be either a foreign regulator giving permission, and on top of that, bridging data, which is what Covishield is applying for, I presume. And the second condition would be local efficacy data, which is what Covaxin is hopefully applying for. Now, with Covishield, we know that there is a study ongoing, the bridging study, but we don't know if it's completed. We don't know how many clinical trial participants have been recruited and what is the nature of data that they have collected. None of that is in the public domain. And likewise for Covaxin, there is a phase 3 efficacy study happening. And that has supposedly recruited almost all of its target of almost 26,000 participants. But that has just about started a couple of months ago. So, even early efficacy data, I'm not so sure would be available. So given these two backgrounds, on what basis was the decision made over this last weekend is what I think we are all questioning. Like, what was the rationale? What was the background? If there was actually data available to the subject expert committee, why is that not in the public domain?
Right. So this subject expert committee sits under the Central Drug Standard Control Organization, and they are the ones who granted it. So I'll come back to these two elements or points that you've raised, Dr. Bhan, in a moment. Murlikanthan, can you tell us, when you look at the process itself, now, how much of this is in keeping with standards that are already in place for launching vaccines, and how much of this are going beyond it, even in the context of the fact that this is an emergency approval?
So the difficulty we have in answering that question for you, and every lawyer will have, is that recent precedent regarding drug regulation and approvals have been different from what has happened earlier. So in 2020, the regulator has been willing to approve drugs which have not shown efficacy. So if you look at itolizumab, for example, remdesivir, favipiravir, and right before that HCQS, there was no efficacy trial data available to us when those drugs were approved for COVID. So that is the context in which now you have to understand how vaccines have been approved. So we made a departure by saying in 2020 that whatever the rule book that there has been, and the rule book is quite recent, 2019, we have decided not to follow it. We haven't replaced it with another rule book, but we have said we're not following that rule book. So basically, the drug regulator is saying, come and talk to us, whoever it is who's developing vaccines, and we'll figure it out as we go along. Now, that means that we don't know what the rules are.
Right, but this is also something that other countries are following or not following if there is or if there isn't a rule book?
No, they have a rule book and they're following it. So when they use the word emergency use authorization, there is a whole list of conditions under which a drug or a vaccine can be given. The US, for example, did a live stream of that session where the approval was granted, issued a memorandum with great detail, including how to open the box, where the vials are, how they should be stored, who it should be given to, in what circumstances it can be given, in what environment it can be given, which means that you must be in a hospital environment to be able to give this vaccine. You must have the ability to take emergency care in case there is a reaction. You must have EpiPen. You must have an emergency room. So there are a whole lot of protocols that have already been developed there for what is meant by emergency use. No, we don't have any of that here.
Right, but that's something. So that's something that Murlikanthan, these countries have had maybe the foresight or maybe the experience to have or include I'm talking about this rule book, whereas India perhaps has not had that or not encountered that situation.
Not quite. What we have done is have a set of rules that came out only in 2019, the new clinical trial rules. And the approval process is linear, which means that you do full clinical trials, you get approval for the drug, you manufacture the drug. Now, there is a lot of flexibility in the rules for the size of the trial you do, what the endpoints are. We left all that to science. I mean, the worst thing you can do is get lawyers to try and explain science in a rule book. So, sensibly, the rules don't deal with any of that. They have a set of procedures. Those procedures have to be followed. And for this vaccine, those procedures have not been followed.
Right. Okay. So I'll come to that, and I'll also come to the method of communication, which you pointed out in a moment. But let's go back to the 2 points that were raised and referred to by Dr. Bhan in the beginning. So the first one is on Covishield, which is to do with the bridging studies. Now, the question, Dr. Bhan, is that in India, which is obviously now seeing, at least at this point, a different trajectory of disease progression or virus progression from other countries, should could the vaccine have the same efficacy, the same impact, or should it even be taken in the same manner in the way it's being administered and received in other countries? So that's the first question. And therefore, the supplementary question is, to what extent do we need a bridging study? And if we need a bridging study, to what extent should it be exclusive and composite enough for India or a country of India's size?
Yeah, so you certainly do need studies. Whether a bridging study by itself is enough given our size of the population is a question. It's a good scientific question to ask. I mean, it's clearly the case that the company made the application and the regulator allowed for this study to happen, which is why it started. As you are also alluding to, there can be sometimes variation from a regional perspective. It's seen specifically, say, with some of the oral vaccines, whereas you have what is known as a tropical barrier. So an oral vaccine which might work very effectively, say, in a high-income country might not work the same way in a low and middle-income country. It might be something to do with our gut immunity, etc. Now, this obviously is an intramuscular administered injection, but then unless you have data in the local context with the local population, you might not always be able to extrapolate, say, the efficacy data you're seeing in another population. So obviously you need to do those studies also to understand safety, etc. Now, you can certainly learn a lot from the experiences which have happened with a large phase 3 clinical trial in a foreign context. And the advantage, say, in a place like UK is that they have a large South Asian population as well. So hopefully there were at least quite a few South Asian participants from which some of this data could be drawn from, but that would be a subpopulation level analysis.
Amongst the first people, or the first person who received the vaccine in the UK was of South Asian, actually Indian descent.
Right. Yes. So the bridging data is important. Now, what has also happened in the UK, as you know, is that the post the trial, they've also gone with the interesting set of strategies where they have delayed the second dose beyond what was actually tried out in the clinical trial. And they've also allowed for an exceptional possibility that there would be a mix and match strategy, which is to say that you could get one vaccine of a particular kind in your first dose, and if it were not to be available when you were getting the second dose, you could get another vaccine. Now, none of that has been trialed out, and so that is sort of a public health experiment happening right now. So obviously you cannot extrapolate all of that, right? But it seems to be the case from what I understand, that in India, the regulator has also allowed for a spacing between the doses, which is not what was actually tried out or at least mentioned in the clinical trial application. So I'm not sure where that, maybe they've drawn from the UK example, but there is no clinical trial data to support it.
Right. So on the bridging, on the bridging data, now what is the ideal size? So you talked about, let's say, 26,000 samples for the Covaxin clinical 3 trial. Is that an ideal sample size that would have been ideal for, let's say, the Oxford-Astrazeneca vaccine as well, which has not been done?
Well, if they were to do an efficacy study, that's the kind of numbers we might have needed. Now, they might have made an inference from the fact that they've already done a large phase 3 efficacy study, not just in UK, but also in other countries. And some of those studies are ongoing, and made the argument that since we've already found efficacy in some of these contexts, that we just want to do a bridging study. And it seems to be the case, as I said, that the regulator has bought that argument. Now, should that number have been higher, etc., probably will require a more detailed look at the protocol. But again, good science, if you have more numbers, it can always give you a better idea around both safety and efficacy. But I presume that the regulator was satisfied with the 1600 number.
Right. So, okay. So there is a study of people in India, but the number is not large enough. And that is one problem with the first vaccine. Now, let's go to the second one. Clinical trials started in November 2020 and are ongoing, and the final results aren't out. So now, how much is that an area of concern, given that I'm assuming, let's say we were to believe everyone in this space, which is the government and the company, who say that trials are progressing, maybe the final results are not out as yet, but we are confident that from whatever we've seen, they seem to be in the right direction, and there is no adverse or no major or significant reaction in patients from the first dose. So, is that a fair set of statements if such statements were made to take on face value?
Yeah, listen, I don't think anywhere globally, any of the trial vaccines have finished their studies, in the sense that you do require follow-up, and typically I would imagine at least a year of follow-up in most circumstances, and that is what is there in the clinical trial protocols for Covaxin as well. So what you will only have probably decisions being taken on is early interim efficacy data. But in most circumstances, the company would probably want to follow up, because you can only figure out long-term efficacy and safety if you follow up for a longer period. You cannot figure that out over a 3-month follow-up period or a slightly longer period, right? So here also, I think the design, from what I remember on the CTRI entry, at least requires a 12-month follow-up for Covaxin.
Correct.
And the earliest time then they might be able to do interim efficacy analysis would probably be at least a couple of months after vaccination. So that would be probably sometime in March or maybe end February, March. Before that, I think any estimation which is being made is likely only around safety and immunogenicity, which is their phase 1 and phase 2 study. I don't think efficacy data can be available at this point of time. If it is available, I'd be very surprised, and hence that's another reason for the regulator to come out and say on what basis they made this decision.
Right. Okay. So let's come now to assuming that we've understood how we are, even if we are flying blind, to what extent we are flying blind in this situation. Let's understand how this could have been made better or simpler for people, that's you and me, to digest. Muralikantan, tell us now, you were talking about the transparency of the process, which in turn, or rather in itself, has created a lot of concern at this time round. So if the process, assuming that we all knew this was a bullet that had to be bitten in this form, given the time constraints, given for whatever reason, and maybe right reasons, the urgency in approving this, then how could it have been done differently in a manner that all of us would have more confidence in taking this vaccine?
First of all, credibility means that you follow the rules. So you can't short circuit the rules. If you need 1 year's data, you cannot get it in 40 days. So you can't short circuit science, and you can't fast track time. So you just have to accept that if you need scientific data of 1 year, you have to wait 1 year. So there is no way in which scientists are saying that we should be working on this data. The lawyer should be saying the rules say you have to only approve a drug if you know its efficacy. And that is the law, that even if you have data from somewhere else, you have to show that it will be efficacious, and there is, and the words are, no probability or evidence that it will not work in India. That's a very high threshold. It is not likelihood. So what you could have done is not jump the gun, waited for trials to finish. You would have had data, and the protocol says 42 days after the second shot. So as Dr. Bhan says, perhaps by March you would have had the data. You could have prepped for an immunization program. People would have continued to behave responsibly, I hope, and waited for test results to come out. Nothing is going to be achieved by this vaccination. Nothing good is going to be achieved by this vaccination in the next 6 weeks.
Okay, so it's boiling down really to 6 to 8 weeks because you're saying March, we're already in the first week of January. Dr. Ban,
Yes.
again, perceptionally, when I look at it, many of these other countries that I mentioned in the beginning, the United States, UK, are already, or citizens in those countries or residents are already getting vaccines. Months have passed and we still are not. Why would then I feel that I am particularly at risk? And would you concur with Murlikantan's point that we should have waited?
Listen, all of us are keen on having a vaccine. I'm clearly, and all of us are advocates of vaccines as well. No one here is in opposition to vaccines. But that doesn't take away the fact that you need to have the fundamentals of science satisfied, right? So you wouldn't want a vaccine which is not working, because there is a lot which goes into vaccination. We've not yet talked about the cost of vaccines, but just the purchase price is just one element of it. There's a whole complex exercise to actually vaccinate a population. Right. So if you're going to make all of that effort, we would want to use something which we are confident about. Now, a vaccine could be safe. It could also be immunogenic, but that might not automatically translate it to being an efficacious vaccine or an effective vaccine when you take it to field, and when you do it in field settings in rural areas with temperature variations, etc. That requires you to collect data, and that data can only come from good quality clinical trials, which is why you do the clinical trials in the first place. If you could just make recommendations based on safety and immunogenicity, then we needed not even have waited this long. The subject expert committee met a few weeks ago, and I think phase 1 and phase 2 data was available at that point of time. If that was just the basis of a decision to be made, then might as well have made that decision then. Why wait till January 1st and 2nd to have your meeting? You could have just decided then and gone ahead. But obviously, they also wanted more data. So what was that more data that they asked for? What was the nature of that data? What does that data indicate, which has made them now satisfied that they are willing to go ahead and give clearance? That is what all of us are asking. I think Murli and me, we would love to see that data and understand the rationale for that decision.
Correct. And you're also saying that all other countries where vaccines, at least the three US, UK, Canada, these countries where the vaccines have been rolled out, all this data, the process, the methodology, everything is available and accessible to the public.
Yes.
Yeah, I think pharma has also been doing a lot of, I think, partly good practices. For example, many pharma companies have voluntarily put their clinical trial protocols in the public domain so that people can read and understand how are these studies designed and what is actually happening. Many regulators have been open about their processes. So the FDA, for example, has livecast its decision meeting, the equivalent of the subject expert committee meetings there. And so you can listen in and find out what are the kind of questions being asked, what are the kind of clarifications. And there are some pretty tough questions asked in these meetings. Yeah. And that helps build trust in the fact that there is a process which is transparent. Now, at the end of the day, I might disagree with that decision, even by a US FDA, and say that, no, I am not satisfied. I would have liked to see more data. But then at least I cannot complain about the fact that I don't know what went into that decision. Now, in India, what we have is we don't know who the subject expert committee members are. We don't know what the process is. We don't know what they are looking at in terms of data based on which they are making a decision. And then you have language which, I'm not a lawyer. Murli can comment on this, but I was not able to decipher that language. I'm still not able to. The way they have put out the recommendations.
Are you talking about the grant of permission for restricted use in emergency situations in public interest as an abundant precaution in clinical trial mode to have more options for vaccinations, especially in case of infections by mutant strains? Is that the language that you're referring to, Dr. Bhan?
Yeah, help us understand if you can.
Okay, I'm not a subject expert. So let me come back to you, both of you, and let me start with you, Murlikantan. So the downside that we're looking at, as I understand it now, is that the vaccine is safe, as in it may not do any damage, but we do not know whether it is actually efficacious at this point or whether it will actually prevent you from getting COVID-19, which is supposed to be the original objective of this vaccine.
Correct. That is one question. And the second are two larger questions. One is the credibility of the regulator. How good is the confidence of people who are taking this, given what the regulator has done? I would be very uncomfortable. Secondly, how does it change our behavior? If it is efficacious and people stop taking the precautions we're taking now because they're vaccinated, there is one scenario. If it is not efficacious, it may be safe. people think they are vaccinated, the vaccination works, they are immune, and start behaving irresponsibly. Then what happens as a situation? So just saying that, listen, it is 110% safe or 200% safe. Now, it can't be 200% safe because if I take it, my wife is not going to be safe, right? I mean, that is 200% safe. It doesn't work like that. So by saying these things, you're causing...
That's more like the Indian manner of speaking. You say, okay, I'm 200% going to be there on time, and 200%
so
going to work.
That's why I said that 200% means me and my wife. I mean, there can't be any other meaning, but go for it. What I meant to say was, when you say these things and people are taking these vaccines when we don't know the efficacy, let's say the efficacy turns out at 50%. Does the common man understand what that 50% efficacy means?
Right.
So there causes a change in behavior, right, of people. And we're already suffering as a consequence of irresponsible behavior. So when you ask what is the downside to everybody being vaccinated now, the downside fundamentally for me is behavior. People are going to behave irresponsibly. Secondly, we're not going to be tracking these people anymore. If you're in clinical trial mode, you know what is happening to these people. Are there adverse events? Is there a way of reporting it? Is there follow-up on it? Can we have data sets and prepare for it and make changes in the vaccination program? So like Dr. Bhan says, if it can't be given in PHCs, then we have to change how we do it. If it can't be given during the summer vacation because we can't preserve this between 2 and 8 degrees, then we have to change how we deliver the vaccines. So those are all the things that we're going to learn during the clinical trials. We can do these dry runs, and then we can make sure the best effect of the vaccine is available to everyone.
Right. Dr. Bhan, last word from you. So there are two vaccines. In one case, we do not have full insight into how it will work in India. In the second case, the phase 3 trials, which measured efficacy, are not complete. And finally, all of this means that and from all the data that we have, that these vaccines are largely safe or known to be safe, but we don't know whether it will work. Is that the clear downside, apart from the fact that the communication or the methodology of communication of this entire process has been weak?
Yeah, well, we know safety in the short term. I wouldn't say that we know completely if these are safe in the long term, but the early indications are fairly positive, and that's what we are living with globally, not just in India. So and efficacy, yes, as you rightly said, we don't have local efficacy data yet, at least not in the public domain for both these vaccines. And the third, I think the most important part, as you rightly said, is confidence in the regulatory process and the lack of opacity, which is not there right now. And I think is probably the most worrisome, because if you had that, I think there could be a certain trust in the process. And, we wouldn't want as many finer details, perhaps, like we are wanting now, because I guess, there is a lot of anxiety and concern about how decisions are being taken.
Right, and that's in some ways is the bottom line, that the process of the vaccine delivery, including of course the data that goes into the creation of it, understood by all that this is a hastened process, it's an emergency process, we need solutions quickly, but the transparency and the manner in which it is communicated to the public at large, and particularly to experts who follow this space, has to be of a much, much higher standard. On that note, thank you, gentlemen, for joining me and shedding light on this matter.
Thank you so much.